Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session of the 12 Days of Assessment webinar series. And so today we're going to be discussing EDI, so Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Assessment. And I'm very pleased to, as always, be joined by Ileana Apuri, who's the mastermind behind this assessment resource. And today we have a special guest with us, Robin Sutherland Harris, who's doing some great work with the Teaching Commons around EDI. And so we're very happy to have her here today to share some of her thoughts about this topic.
Thank you.
And so we do like to start off with the land acknowledgement. So we recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Waffle Milk Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And with that, we do invite you to, to check out some of these links below. So some articles from YFile and a YouTube video that was created that helps further explain the land acknowledgement from the York University perspective. So we know that there's, it means many different things to many different people. And so we do encourage you to look up some more information if you are curious about the land acknowledgement itself.
Can I share at this point an additional link? I'll post it in the chat for now, and then maybe when we share this later, it can go in a link or something near the recording.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is a video that I came across recently that is just a really lovely kind of short 3.5 minute video that is a land acknowledgement and a land reflection that is specifically rooted in an oral history of Toronto. So it's very specific to the GTA, and it's very beautiful and just has a lot of really lovely reflective moments.
Great.
So I think that's another nice way to engage with this stuff.
Oh, thank you, Robin. And we'll make sure that that link is posted on the assessment website as well once we have these this webinar up as well. So thank you. And we do want to just draw your attention if you are not aware yet of our Going Remote website. And so this was created back in March of 2020 to help provide teaching support in this online context. And so whether it's starting thinking about course design or assessments or accessibility, right? So it's a nice starting point if you are still just kind of wondering about some of the ins and outs of remote teaching. It's a great resource to check out. And we do offer drop-in support, right? So Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Someone will be in the Teaching Commons Zoom room. So you can check out this link here on this slide, or as well on the Going Remote website. And you can chat with one of the educational developers with the Teaching Commons about any any questions that you might have coming up related to your teaching.
Quite often it will be one of the three of us in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And with this, I will turn things over to I think Robin and Ileana. So I don't know if Ileana wants to say a few words to start, but I will now slowly step back from the spotlight here.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Robin, for joining us. I will let you introduce yourself, and we're going to have a more of a discussion-based webinar today. So Robin is going to give us her point of view, and we can discuss this with her. Robin?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Robin Sutherland Harris. I'm also an educational developer at the Teaching Commons, where I do quite a bit of work around e-learning. We have a certificate of proficiency in teaching for e-learning. So I do all of those courses that contribute to that and manage that. So you may recognize me if you've been engaged in those. We've had quite a few people go through them. And increasingly, I'm also working on EDI related offerings at the Teaching Commons. So right now we're running a course on inclusive design, building principles of equity and inclusion into teaching in higher education. So it's basically specifically focusing on course design and how we can use principles like universal design for learning from the sort of ground up with course design. And we're also launching a course shortly, later this month, as part of the certificate on access and equity, specifically in teaching online. So some of the concerns around the online environment specifically and how that impacts access and equity. And I guess I'm also the liaison for the humanities departments, as that is where my own disciplinary background lies. Thank you. Should I continue with talking about the agenda for today, or did you want to do that, Eliana?
Thank you, Robin. So today we're going to talk about bias and the role of bias in assessment. We're going to talk about equity in assessing ESL students. So if you have students from different backgrounds or students who speak English as a second or a foreign language, what concerns are there when doing their assessment? And also we're going to talk about equity, some concerns in equity related to equity and peer and self-assessment. I think, Robin, you can start the discussion and then we can contribute with you. Is that okay?
Sure. So, I mean, starting with bias in assessment, I guess there's sort of three questions that we can dig into here, and I think each of them will take a bit of unpacking because they're pretty big questions. So the first one, I guess we could start talking there. What are the obvious forms of bias that might impact student assessment? And then what are the less obvious or more hidden forms of bias? And here I'm really thinking, you know, in the obvious forms, that this is the sort of things that you don't actually see all that often, fortunately, but that do still exist around, you know, outright racism or discrimination directed towards students or student groups, and that kind of sort of more sort of surface level, as in more visible type of bias against students. But then there are also many less obvious or more hidden forms of bias that we can also think about, like confirmation bias, stereotype threat, and how those can impact students. So do you want to sort of share your thoughts on that now, like what you sort of see as those two forms of bias and how they might impact students? Or
yes, thank you, Robin, for bringing this up. Like some of the things that I can think about are related to the positionality of the instructor themselves, and this impacts what is chosen as an assessment method and what is chosen as an assessment content. So, correct me if I'm wrong, this would take us back to the different ways of doing assessment and being flexible and allowing different people to demonstrate their learning in the way that works for them. So this is in my mind, when you're choosing your method of assessment, you're biased toward how people should demonstrate their learning, and that everyone should be demonstrating their learning in the same way.
Yeah. And I think that is it's a very subtle and kind of pernicious bias in many ways, because often what it ends up looking like is that have a slight preference towards assessment methods that would work for you as a learner. So, for example, I really find it very helpful to, use writing as a thinking tool. And so for me, thinking things out, I often write, and I often find myself inclined towards creating assessments that encourage students to do the same thing, especially as I come from a writing-heavy disciplinary background. And that gets kind of prioritized in the disciplinary context as well, which is probably why I ended up falling into it in the first place. So I think it's very worthwhile being aware of this being a bias that can manifest in terms of learning preferences or a kind of favoritism in the way that you design assessments that ends up helping students who have similar approaches to learning, and as you do, as the instructor does.
Yes, and this makes me think about my favorite way of representing learning is through schemas or through drawings. And this is why when I was like, for example, when I was doing when I was writing my PhD thesis, I would just make graphs the whole time and make concept maps and my supervisor was like, what is this? You need to write it in a paragraph. But for me, like if it has to make sense as a map at the beginning, and then I can write it down. And like this shows the difference between the different ways of how people demonstrate learning.
Yes. So for example, if I were in my course, teaching an undergraduate history course or something, for example, I might be inclined to think about, okay, what I really want is my students to demonstrate their thinking about how these scholarly sources are in conversation with one another on this particular topic. And what I might kind of inadvertently do is create an assessment that really privileges those students who can write about that. If I'm being very sort of, trying to think flexibly about assessment, I might create something that is a bit more structured, or that is not, it's not like write something formal, but it's like, write some short paragraphs or fill in this worksheet or something, but it's still, my own inclination is still going to push me towards thinking about, oh, write it down. Whereas obviously from what you've said, Eliana, like could be equally valid for a student to think through that by doing a mind map or making a graph of how the different authors' positions relate to one another. And if what I'm really interested in is not the writing skill, but the thinking process, then that is an assessment that's it's measuring the wrong thing. And that's a bias. It's measuring the writing. It's not measuring the thinking that I'm actually trying to get at. So another thing that's maybe relevant here is the idea of separating the means from the ends. So if your learning outcome for a particular assessment is your end, your goal, you want to make sure that the means by which your students achieve that are not interfering with their achievement of that goal. Sometimes this is called construct relevance. Yeah.
Oh, this is the construct relevant means when the means does not interfere with the way
you've constructed the assessment is relevant to the outcome, right? When you don't have construct relevance, it's the way that the construct that the assessment is kind of built in is irrelevant to the thing that you're trying to actually measure with the assessment.
Thank you, Robin. I learned a new word. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is like, for me, this is the first type of bias that as an instructor myself, I think about when I'm designing an assessment, and I try to think about it. Like, am I showing privilege toward one way of showing knowledge? And is this way my way of showing knowledge? Like, am I asking the students to make concept maps the whole time? Maybe they really don't like. So do you agree with me, Robin, that maybe providing flexibility for students, allowing them to choose their favorite way, or maybe giving them a couple of ways to choose from would be a way to address this bias?
Yes, absolutely. This is something that's really at the core of universal design for learning. It's one of the 3 core tenets, the multiple means of action and expression. So giving your students different ways to demonstrate what they have learned. I think this is often a challenge, especially when it is first presented to us as instructors, because it just seems like so much work, right? Like if you're going to create assessments that kind of don't have any set form and students can do whatever they want with them, and then doesn't that increase your grading load instrumentally, and so on. So I think one of the things that it's important to remember is you don't have to address all of the possible ways of doing something with every single assessment. So if you have, if in your course every single assessment is a multiple choice, then that might be a problem for students who do poorly at a multiple choice. But if in your course you have, say, 4 term assessments, one of them is a multiple choice, one is something written, one is a concept map, and one is something else, then that kind of balances things out, because it gives your students opportunities to kind of boost their ability to demonstrate what they've learned in the assessment styles that work for them. And then if they do struggle with some of the other versions, it's not quite so much a hit to their success in the course. So it's not really about saying like, you have to have like 5 different options for every single assessment. If you can have 2, that's great. And if you can vary the types of assessment that you're using throughout a course, that's a really great strategy that can also allow you to not completely overload yourself as an instructor.
Thank you, Robin. This is what I always say. Start small, like choose one thing, or choose it one time, one assessment. Try it in one assessment. And then when it is a success and you feel more comfortable, you can then expand and do it more.
Yeah.
It's a challenge to just scrap everything you do and then create everything, new stuff all the time. Just start with something small.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the big proponents of universal design for learning, Tom Tobin, advocates this as the +1 approach, which is basically just, when you're starting to think about universal design for learning, don't feel like you need to gut your course and start from scratch and redesign everything. And because I think if you get very interested in this and you believe in its principles, it can be tempting to do that, but it also can be very overwhelming and it can be an incredible amount of work. So if you're able to just pick one thing, add an additional way that students can express their success in meeting learning outcomes, or add one additional way that you're sort of sharing student information in a different format, whatever it is, just add one thing to the variety of your course, see how it goes, figure out if it works or not for you, for your course, for your students, and then kind of move on from there. It doesn't have to be a complete overhaul.
Thank you, Robin. This also makes me think, you mentioned that this could be a challenge to the instructors. I would also say that it's sometimes a challenge to the students because they're not used to this. And I would advise that you don't get demotivated by this. It happened to me in my courses. I do allow total flexibility. I give them the learning outcomes that they need to show, and they need to show me that they learned. And I tell them, you choose the means and you choose how to show me this. And every single time I did this, most of the students, and not to say all of them, they have difficulty choosing or finding what is the best way, or even understanding what I mean by this. And I usually have to explain this more than one time and to talk to every student and give them the options that they can do, ask them questions that would direct them to things that they might be interested in doing. So like, for example, yes, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Robin.
No, I definitely agree that it can be super overwhelming for students as well. Having too much choice and too much flexibility is another level of stress and another thing to do, right? So then somehow you're also assessing them on their ability to make a good choice at that stage in the process, whether you want to or not, right? So having some, as you say, Eliana, either having the ability and willingness to do that kind of like repeated communication and individualized support to help walk students through that process, or having some bounded decisions, right? So it's like choose A, B, or C, right?
Yes.
You do this on this topic, or this topic, or choose the topic, but do it in this mode or this mode, can be very helpful. And I think you're right also that the question of clear and repeated communication comes up. I think this is something that we're all learning is especially valuable in the online environment, is just the clarity and redundancy of instructions and information that are provided to students at different points along the way, in different mediums, not just on the sort of assignment sheet where you're sort of telling them what to do, or once or twice in the course, but repeatedly and in lots of different ways so that people have clarity. And I think this is another way that we learn incrementally over time what information and how to present it for students in ways that are going to be clear for them, especially when we're dealing with more variables in our assignments.
Yes, that's true. I also saw one thing before we move to the next topic. I saw an instructor who would give different methods that students can choose, and then there was a most chosen method. And this most chosen, the instructor told them that, let's say, 60% of the students chose this last semester. So this helped the students choose something.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great idea. I just pasted in the chat as well a link to a website, the TILT website, or Transparency in Learning and Teaching, I think. And they have a lot of really great examples that are very helpful around developing and designing assessments that have really clear and explicit instructions that are beneficial for students. So on the website that I linked to, if you kind of scroll down, there's a whole section on example assignments that are more and less transparent. So that's, I find, very helpful for faculty in seeing, you know, here is an example of an assignment instructions that are sort of like hard for students to understand, and then here how they've been revised in a way that is going to be easier for students to understand. And then if you go just a little bit farther towards the bottom of that page, there's a section that has tools for revising and creating your own transparent assignments, and for gathering feedback on your assignments as well. So those are also really helpful, and some of those are useful tools for students to make sure that they understand what the assignment is asking them to do as well. So not just for faculty in the development of the assignment, but for students in understanding what they're actually doing. And this is, you know, it is about equity, right? Making sure that the communication around how you're assessing your students is understandable to everyone in your course.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for sharing this resource. It's great. I think I wanted to check with Brian if he had anything to share about this or any experience.
This is, I'm having a lot of fun just, you know, listening to the back and forth, but I'm just going to echo, you know, a lot of what's been said. So, you know, from the student perspective, right, having the options, but sometimes having too many options. And I think it's going to come down to, again, a lot of this is your teaching context, you know, kind of dependency. So if it's a first year course, you might want to be more directed with some of the different options, but as you maybe get to a fourth year, higher level, you know, make a seminar style or just, you know, a more close knit class, right? Maybe you can open it up and be much more open-ended with the type of assessment the students are choosing. And so maybe you're not giving them as many as concrete options, but keeping it more open, again, letting them, you know, kind of having that autonomy with their own learning. And then from the instructor, you know, it's the whole, you know, you teach as you learn, basically, that whole concept. And, you know, it takes a lot of work, you know, kind of internally to, you know, to unlearn what you've been doing and what you think is best for your students based on your own and only your own experiences. And so, you know, having that, you know, like emotional willpower to be able to take a critical look at yourself and your own teaching and your own, you know, how you're designing your assessments, and, you know, bringing it back to, again, the whole constructive alignment piece. So, you know, making sure that you have your outcomes, you have an end goal in mind, and then the pathway that you're setting for your students is actually one that is conducive to those end goals, and whether the pathway is different, right? So again, this leads to the different options, the different, you know, kind of having those choices, but you're still going to arrive at the same point. It just, you know, the journey is going to be different for each of the students. And sometimes as an instructor, it's hard to let go of some of that control but it's important for really for the growth and learning of both student and faculty, I think. So
Thank you, Brian.
I agree with everything Brian just said.
I'm just repeating what,
Yes.
what you both
We're
are.
all agreeing with each other. Well, shall we move on?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, so my next question here for conversation is the sort of loaded and large question of, is technology unbiased? I think there are so many different directions that we could go in this, in terms of access to technology, even in terms of stable internet connections, whether your students all have laptops, especially when we're looking at everyone teaching and learning remotely. Just the sort of basic kind of hardware, access to hardware issues, and the different ways that some of your learners are going to be interacting with your course materials on a laptop or a desktop, and some are going to be interacting with your materials on their phone or on a tablet. And what does that mean in terms of what they're able to access and what they see? It can be quite different from one platform or one device to another in that context. But really kind of the big thing that I was thinking about with this was online proctoring and the issues that we have seen emerge around that, which is less of an issue or a concern at York, where they've made some recent decisions about minimizing the use of ProctorTrack and online proctoring software at York. So you really have to, I think, argue for quite a high level of need for that software in order to make use of it going forward. But I think it's an interesting point where we collectively, as higher education in general, kind of really jumped on the idea of online proctoring when the pandemic first started, out of concern around academic integrity issues. And then almost immediately things became increasingly obvious that there were some real equity issues around around that piece of technology. So, for example, ways in which the underlying AI software that is used to recognize, the way that it works is so the software looks at you as a student taking the course or taking the test, and sort of flags what it considers to be suspicious behavior. And that's partly determined by a set of input measures that are determined per test by on a case-by-case basis, but it can include things like if you have food or beverage in the room, if you're sort of looking away, if there are other people moving through the environment that you're in, if you're seen talking, so there's lots of different things. But then it also tracks facial expressions and eye movements, and it also needs to be able to recognize your face as a human face. And the underlying technology that is used in this has been shown in several studies and certainly through anecdotal experience of students and others, to really have difficulty properly recognizing darker skin tones. So students of color, Black students, are sometimes really having a hard time just getting the software to recognize that they are there in front of their computer about to take the test, and they have to set up special lighting and so on, which is just ridiculous. And then other sort of glitches around how the software might read facial expressions if you don't have Caucasian type features. So it can sort of read things as suspicious in ways that are not suspicious, just based on that. And then there are additional equity concerns around students who might do better by reading out loud, and then it looks like they're talking to the software and they assume that that is suspicious behavior, or they might really need to move around a lot physically in order to do their best thinking, and that can be a problem for the software as well. So in terms of what it decides to flag as suspicious behavior for review. So there's definitely a lot of issues there. Fortunately, we've kind of stepped back from that as a solution to all of our academic integrity concerns. But anyway, sorry, I'll stop talking so that you guys can jump in there.
I actually have things to say about this. I designed and analyzed a survey about Proctor Track to students that went out to students and faculty, which I think partially informed the decision to not go with Proctor Track long term. So it's very curious. It's interesting to see a lot of the responses, right? And the students were not happy about it as a, just in terms of, like increasing the stress levels and, like to Robin's point, if a student is looking up while thinking, right, that's going to be flagged as, looking around the room. And, that even students were saying there's nothing to stop you from putting another screen or something right behind your screen, and you can still just look beyond and still look at another screen that's not being tracked. And what was interesting, so on York's website, it claimed that I think like a hand scan is also something that Proctor Track could do. And so I think to see if it's basically your own hands that are like on the keyboard. And on York's website, it would say, this is not York does not require this. But then students in the feedback were saying it felt very weird having my eyes and my hands scanned. This was worse than, like trying to go through customs at, like an international border crossing just to write an exam. And so, yes, there is definitely a lot of student concern and faculty concern too about the impact that it was having on their students. So I'm glad to see that the ultimate decision was made, I think, to only in those special case circumstances. And a lot of them are just for the courses or programs that are for accreditation that have that like governing oversight. So they have those, I guess, standards that
they have to be
met in order to, basically stay in an accredited program. And so I think that's where, it's fine if it's well communicated to the students, right? So it needs to be very clear up front when you're registering for the course. Does it use any form of, not even just proctor, but e-proctoring service? Like, is there some form of e-proctoring with the course? Because I think some students were getting caught off guard too by not realizing really what they were getting themselves into signing up for course. And all of a sudden it's, by the way, you have to, install this software that is going to, look at you through your own camera. And so there was a lot of kind of unsettled concerns about that one.
Yeah, and as you say, Brian, there hasn't been a lot of evidence that this software actually does prevent academic integrity issues. I'm sure that it touches more than we might otherwise see, but it also doesn't necessarily prevent things if you are determined. I mean, if you go onto Reddit, there's whole giant Reddit discussion boards explicitly talking about how exactly to get around whatever specific proctoring software it is that you're using as a student. So yeah, and there was something else that I wanted to say. Maybe has slipped my mind.
I wanted to add. No, I like. Thank you for sharing all these important things. I also thought about like the neurodivergent student and the added stress that this could be like added to them, like some a machine that's watching, and then the facial expressions, and then the needs for like different ways of expressing yourself. I think you remember what I wanted to say, Robin.
Yes, because it was about the machine that's watching, which was also in what Brian was talking about. And I think that there's something to this that plugs into a larger issue around the technology that we use for online teaching that really increases the amount of surveillance that students are under or feel that they're under in ways that get away from what we would normally expect in a face-to-face environment. So I'm thinking, yes, certainly with these assessments, but also for things like if, for example, if I was thinking about taking a face-to-face course that I might teach with undergraduates and putting it into an online environment, I might want to think about, okay, so instead of tutorial discussions, I'm going to have them do discussion board forums. And what would be very different about that is that in a tutorial discussion, there's a lot of conversation and discussion that is really ephemeral, that just kind of arises in the moment and falls away. I don't necessarily hear what everybody is saying if I've put them into small groups or something. I'm not like policing every single thing that everybody is saying, and I'm not even aware of it. And there's room for students to sort of feel like they can say foolish things, that they can talk to each other about, like how they don't even know what page we're supposed to be looking at right now in the readings. And all of that stuff, and kind of fumble their way through the learning in a way that is very authentic and completely unsurveilled. Whereas if I'm doing the same kind of thing in an online discussion forum and also kind of folding that into a participation grade as part of the assessment strategy for my overall course, it's very different because it's not, I mean, it might feel like a similar kind of conversation, especially if you're skilled at kind of creating discussion board prompts and you can get students responding to one another and actually having a conversation, but it's all there for you to read every single word that they say and thought that they have. There's none of that kind of shapeless ephemeral stuff that they can kind of bumble through and then it's lost in the ether, but can still count towards their learning. They feel, I think, much more like everything that they write is assessed for the quality of what they're putting out there. So that's, I mean, it just kind of pulled me back into thinking about the way that technology is not neutral in that it just encourages this surveillance mentality of what learning is happening in the classroom, the online classroom.
Yes, that's true. And like, it takes me back to the whole society. Like for me, things that I did when I was 18 or 15 are not stored anywhere. But now like kids who are 15 or 18, they have so many of the things that they do or think or write or learn are stored somewhere. And the technology, that's a very important. And thank you, Robin.
And there's a real gift to being able to let that stuff just disappear into the past, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Shall we move to the third question?
Yeah.
I'm waiting for this question.
Do you want to start?
Oh, it makes me think about, oh, no. I was thinking about something else. Ignore me. You go ahead.
I think that we've hit on a lot of the sort of the best things that we can do to guard against bias in assessment is like, think about flexibility, think about different ways that your students can come at things from different perspectives. Try to interrogate your own preferences for learning and the sort of default ways that you're doing things, whether that's informed by, sometimes it's informed by your preferences for learning, sometimes it's informed by disciplinary norms and course contexts that we've been part of and sort of operating within for so long that it's easy to forget that like you could actually do something a little bit different, or that it could look a little different in terms of this assessment structure for your course. It doesn't have to be, as you said, a complete overhaul, but it could be, something a bit different. So those are some of the most accessible and effective ways, I think.
I think, yes, I remembered something. It's about get feedback from your students.
Yes.
Like, say you did a course and you did an assessment. So why don't you ask your students what they thought about this? Did this represent their learning? Did they feel that there was some kind of bias there? Do they have suggestions of how they would make this better?
Yeah.
What do you think, Robin?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think soliciting feedback from students is always great. I think Brian probably has some stuff to say about different ways that you can get sort of feedback from students in your classroom in ways that don't feel overly burdensome to them. I think that there's a bit of a risk if you're constantly giving your students like, here's a survey about this assessment, here's a survey about that assessment, like please tell me what you thought about whether this course content was engaging enough. You know, they can get a bit fatigued by constantly being asked to provide assessment. But yeah, Brian, if you want to talk about like different strategies for getting information about how well your assessments are doing from your students without them also feeling like they're just constantly, you know, filling out forms for you.
A little bit on classroom assessment techniques, or formative assessment, if you will. So one example that I've used in my class. So it was when it was face to face still. So I guess it was last year at some point. A large first year course, so over 300 students, and just trying to get some early feedback on. It was the beginning of the course. So, you know, like, what are you most excited for about the course? What are you really nervous for? Just to give me a sense of, you know, what topics, you know, might I need to, you know, pay extra attention to. I used a real-time word cloud function that was actually really fun. So Mentimeter was the website. And you can do, I like that. I like that site. A lot of different options for survey type of things. So, you know, not just necessarily a straight survey, different polls. The real-time word cloud was fun. What I learned though is need to be willing or able to think quickly on your feet and maybe shut down some comments that maybe pop up that aren't, you know, maybe the most appropriate at times. But yeah, so, you know, lots of different, you know, different ways. I was thinking about something that I'm not thinking about anymore, and so maybe if it comes back, I will chime in again.
Yes, no worries. It happened to me.
I was wondering, should we go to the next slide?
I think so, for the sake of time.
Yeah, because we could just talk forever about this one slide, I think. But,
yes.
So there's a couple of resources here that I wanted to share that kind of touch on some of these topics that we've been talking about. One thing that I think is a very useful resource is these various tests from Harvard University about self-assessing implicit biases, which are just very fascinating to go through and take, and, you know, probably will surprise you at some point along the way, the sort of strange things that have made it into your subconscious, whether you like it or not, in the society that we live in. So that can be a really useful tool just for, you know, kind of enhancing your own awareness of where your biases might lie in ways that you don't necessarily anticipate that they might. There's a great resource from the DePaul Teaching Commons on assessment and bias that talks about confirmation bias and stereotype threat, which I mentioned earlier and which we haven't had time to get into, but at least it's there as a resource on the slide. And then there's a really great reflection piece on some of the stuff around test proctoring and the non-neutrality of technology in assessment.
Thank you, Robin. I think, Brian, we will have these on the assessment webpage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We can add those to our suggested readings list as well.
Thank you.
And my thought popped back into my brain. Think of just like one of the, you know, like biases or ways to guard against it. And one thing that came to mind was even little things like pop culture references, right? So assuming that your students are going to know what references you are referring to if it's pop culture. An example I have when I was a TA for a first year biomechanics course. And one of the questions was about, so if you like choking up on a baseball bat, how does that impact like how easy or hard it is to swing the bat? And during the exam, so many times I've had a lot of questions of what does that mean to like choke up on a bat? And so, you know, having like a kind of a random sport baseball reference that not everyone is going to be aware of just the terminology. And so, you know, having to, you know, just think about, you know, as an instructor, what that those little, it doesn't seem like it would be a huge deal. But then from a student perspective, it's, oh yeah, if you don't know any of these references or that sort of, genre of whatever, then you might struggle with trying to interpret how a question is written. And I do not actually write the question either. And so I think that's if people know me as a huge baseball fan, they probably think that was me just injecting that. But no, so I think at one point the instructor just has to get up and basically interrupt the exam and just say, okay, getting this question a lot, here's what this means. And so, it ends up being a little bit disruptive and whatnot, but, just little things like, a pop culture reference could have large implications in terms of, kind of how your students are interpreting that.
Yeah, that's
Thank
a great
you.
point.
Sorry, Robin. It makes me think about ESL learners or international students in your classroom. I had this experience myself, and like so many of the pop culture references, I could not even understand. Even TV shows or songs or whatever, I couldn't even relate to what that is. So thank you for mentioning this, Brian. I see you moved to the next slide, Robin.
Because it was such a perfect segue.
Yes.
Sometimes it's just age. Sometimes my pop culture references are more a reflection of my age and not so much the content. But
I have a friend who, in his undergrad classes with English students, not English speaking students, but like in the Department of English, used to have them do a close reading of My Milkshake Brings All the Boys to the Yard, that song, as like an exercise in close reading, which worked really well for a while, but then now that's just like some weird old song that nobody really has listened to. So it's like, it's kind of prevented it from being effective now that it's a bit older.
I have no idea what the song is. I don't know if it's the age. I think it's the culture.
I'll send it to you later.
Thank you.
you're not really missing out.
So I guess I don't know how much time we have. Not a ton. We might only make it through the first of these questions, but I think that's a pretty good place to start, which is how and where is assessing language mastery or writing skills really about assessing privilege? So here I think the question is, it's really about, again, it has to do with this idea of construct relevance and whether, you are getting at understanding what your students have mastered in terms of the learning outcome, the knowledge that they've attained in your course, or whether you're attaining or assessing their ability to write in a particular way, in a particular sort of idiom and vernacular and disciplinary approach to writing and so on. So there's a lot there that is available for students who have certain kinds of privilege and maybe not available for students who have other kinds of life experiences and perhaps less privilege in that particular context.
I want to add something here that so this makes me think about I was giving a session a couple of weeks ago about assessing ESL students, and one of the things that came up was that why do I keep forgetting? I'm sorry. Just one second. Okay, so when you're reading, when you're assessing students and when you're grading, and if you look at a student's paper and you see that that student didn't has so many, for example, grammar mistakes or so many links mistakes, that might irritate you. And I don't know if this is the right word, but that might cause you to put the student in a certain stereotype and assess the rest of the paper or the rest of the evaluation based on that stereotype that you put the student in. For example, I'm going to speak about my mother tongue, which is Arabic. And in Arabic, let's say, we say I drink a cigarette. We don't say I smoke a cigarette. So the Arabic language, and also, for example, the verb thaw, solve, and melt are the same word. So I keep, like, for example, telling my husband I'm going to melt something from the freezer, and he keeps laughing at me. You don't melt something, you thaw it, you let it thaw. And so think about it this way: if you are assessing a student and if you are reading a student's assessment and you come through some of these technical words, you might think that the students don't know what they're talking about. But it actually, like, their first language is impacting the way they are expressing in the English language. And one of the advice is to look at the big picture and not get stuck in these small little details. I don't know if it made sense. Robin, did it make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's not even just a question of sort of larger vocabulary, as in the examples that you've provided, but also it can happen with, for example, preposition use, which can be very different in different languages. So then you might have a student whose mother tongue is like uses at and to and from and of in different ways. And then that kind of migrates over into their English writing, and that can kind of have the effect of shifting your perception of how well they actually understand the content or, that they're communicating with you. So this is something that I've thought about a lot, because I've taught on very multicultural and diverse campuses in a very writing heavy discipline with lots of, I mean, history it's not just the study of the past, but it also is a genre of writing that requires, part of what we're doing is training students in how to write in that very particular way. So I think that your point about trying to look at the big picture, trying to separate out the writing skills from the content in what you're assessing is incredibly important. Because if you're assigning, say, 20% of your research grade to grammar and spelling and syntax, is that really 20% of the grade that's going just to a certain level of privilege in writing background or writing skills background? When you should also be looking at least as much at least in my discipline, at things like argument construction, effective use of choice and use of evidence. Those are the things that are really the backbone of historical thinking and historical text. And then the polishedness of the writing can come later. But if the ability to think through sources and create effective arguments isn't there, then that's much more of a detriment to actually mastering both the understanding of history and your ability to communicate it effectively to other people.
Yes, thank you for explaining what I wanted to say in better words. This also, it makes me think about one other thing, is that when students are learning English as a second or a foreign language, and in my case, English, for example, was my third language that I was learning. So there's the English for everyday life, and there's the academic English that you use at university and school. And academic English takes more time to acquire than everyday English. So when the students do an English test to come to university in Canada, they're not as much being assessed on the academic English, and it might take them a lot of time of being immersed in the academic culture to reach that academic English knowledge. So,
yes. Yeah. And another thing that can happen, that I've seen happen, is students are very aware of this, right? That they're being assessed at their ability to write in a particular genre that they may not be fluent in, right? Like the academic English as distinct from other forms of English. This also is kind of starting to fold into the second question, right? In that certain racialized groups have different versions of speaking English. And so assessing academic English as the default English it's not a neutral kind of stance. Anyway, I have seen cases where students who are very aware of looking like they want to make sure that their written assignments sort of look more like academic English over rely on a thesaurus, for example, so that they're trying to replace the words that they would have chosen with words that sound to them more in line with academic English or sort of more whatever fancy, I suppose, English. And it can shift the meaning of what they're trying to say. It can move them away from the clarity in the arguments that they're making. in ways that, you know, they're attempting to succeed at this, but then it can be very unhelpful. So giving students, this is kind of getting at the third question, although we can kind of backtrack over these, but giving students ways or opportunities to write in their own voice, right? Like not requiring that everything in your course is written in academic English, but allowing students opportunities to also, you know, if you have a part where you're asking students to reflect on a particular source that you've given them or on a particular piece of course content, like letting that happen in whatever language is most comfortable, whatever version of English is most comfortable to them. And that is perfectly acceptable. Create some space for ESL students to, you know, communicate in ways that are less policed around their writing skills.
So this, Robin, I think this would bring up some concerns for instructors when if they say that what about the standards and what about the bar?
Yes.
Lowering the bar, are we disadvantaging these students by allowing them to present a less a different type of quality of work than their other colleagues? Like I remember I had this discussion with an instructor that if I'm allowing the student to write in their type of English, and when they finish this course, they wouldn't have reached that academic knowledge that I wanted them to, while their other colleagues would have reached that English academic knowledge.
So I think that if writing in a particular way, writing English in an academic way, consistent in your discipline, is one of the outcomes for your course, if that's, and for your degree, for example, if that's something that students need to be able to do when they come out of your program, whether that's at the course level or at the end of their 4 years, then that's something you also need to be teaching across the board, right? So if you're not teaching that, but you're only assessing it, then that's a problem. And if you are teaching it, then you can teach it at different levels. In an introductory course, you can make more space for students to use different ways of writing, and you can give them more coaching around how to move towards the type of academic writing that you want them to be able to perform later. And then you can kind of scaffold that throughout multiple courses as they go through a program, or multiple stages of your course if you're trying to do that over the span of just one course. So that would be my response to that is, yeah, you don't have to lose sight of the standards, but I think you can't assess the standards without teaching them.
Yes, it also makes me think about the importance of providing the safe space of when you see that a student is having challenges, like direct them to places where they can get this kind of support if you are not able to provide it in your course. So by mentioning to the students that they can go to the writing center or they can get this kind of support, or this is the mistake or the type of feedback that you give them, this is the error and this is how you can fix it. This provides them with a safe space that they know that in addition to being assessed and getting grades, they're also getting feedback and support on how to become better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Should we look at the resources? That's the next slide. Okay.
I think we can put them also on the website.
Great. Okay, so I'll just mention them. There's a few that kind of speak to stuff that we haven't tackled as much in our conversation. For example, the first article is it's a journal article about decentering whiteness in English language teaching, which has some very interesting stuff to say in there, and language diversity and policy and educational access and equity. They're just really great additional resources for those who are interested. And then on a sort of more practical and a recent post from Inside Higher Ed around tackling linguistic bias in our classrooms, which I think touches on a lot of what we have already talked about in terms of flexibility and teaching, right? Like if you're assessing it, you've got to do some teaching of it. You've got to actually support the skill development that you're trying to measure.
Thank you, Robin. I think did we want to stop here, or did we want to keep the discussion going?
We're about an hour in right
Yeah.
now. And so, maybe this is a good place to wrap. I'll just say, I don't think we give ESL students or individuals as a whole maybe enough credit as we should, because, I would say, so Ilian, I would say your English is better than my Arabic. And so, like if people are worried, if ESL, I'm, it's not the right word, struggling with the word, like that's, I think we sometimes forget that it's another language, like just trying to think about another language for most people is like mind-blowing. And so to be able to articulate 2 or 3 languages is I think deserves more credit than we often allow that. So
thank you, Brian. And I want to say something to instructors. It's not throwing the whole burden on your shoulders. It's a common task that also administration needs to assess, to take part in it. Like everybody needs to support the ESL students. It's not something that you will do alone, but it starts with you to provide the safe space.
I would also say that anything that you do in your courses to support English language learners is also going to be of incredible benefit for everyone in your course, whether they're speaking English as a first language or not. If you put in supports around, as I was saying, like how to write proper, academic prose for this particular disciplinary context, that's going to help everyone in your course coming out of a high school environment or trying to get a handle on the discipline, or people who are moving into your course from, being maybe a major in a different field, and now they've kind of moved into your disciplinary context, and they just are, there are these big and important differences in how writing works in different contexts, and it's important to be really clear and transparent about that, not just for the purpose of supporting language learners, but for the purpose of supporting everyone. So it's not, if you put energy into this, it's not energy that is only going to benefit some smaller subsection of your students. It's going to benefit all of them.
100%.
Cross discipline.
Yes.
In the sciences, right? Teaching science writing, definitely there's a lot of English native speakers who need a lot of help with, scientific writing. And so, like I said, it's beneficial to everyone involved.
Yep. Even in writing heavy disciplines, if you have a native speaker of English coming from an English department where they've taken a lot of courses there into a history department, and they try to write their history paper as if it were an English paper, they're not going to do well, right? Like it's a very different approach to writing and thinking about the content. And if you can't support your students in how to do it effectively, then they're going to kind of misstep for all different kinds of reasons with where you want them to end up, hopefully, in terms of the learning.
Thank you. I think we can have enough discussions about equity and assessment.
Yes, this could go on for another hour, I think, if we allowed ourselves to. So
I feel like we've been rushing.
Are there any other like slides that just need to be shown, or because we'll make sure we'll have these posted with the recording as well, and we'll make sure the resources are even separated out and put directly on the web page for our suggested readings.
We were going to talk about peer and self-assessment and equity, but maybe that's a separate webinar that is about peer and self-assessment, and then equity is part of that conversation.
Sounds like a good blog post.
Okay, Brian. Yep. Okay.
No, you both have already done a lot for the blog, so.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be here and have this conversation with you. And kind of rambling, but very enjoyable. Yeah. I know we didn't get to everything, and there's a lot that we could have talked about that we didn't talk about, but I think people who might be viewing this later can also feel free to contact us if they have any questions that come up as a result of anything that we've talked about here or that we didn't talk about here, but we maybe should have talked about here. So there's a lot of room to continue these conversations.
Yes, that's true. Thank you.
This was great. Thank you, Robin, for joining us. Thank you, Ileana, as always, for help keeping the conversation moving forward. And thanks everyone at home who's been listening in. And if this is within a week of it being posted, next week we'll be discussing large classrooms. And if it's a couple weeks later, then feel free to check out our next recording on large classrooms. But looking forward to keeping this webinar series going over the next few weeks. So thanks again to Robin, and as always, Ileana, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you,
Thank you, Brian. See you. Bye.
Bye.